Imagine the evening of 2 May 1945, when the German surrender in Italy takes effect, and the curfews still hold in Rome and Genoa. You walk past blackout-painted curbstones as church bells mark the hour and Allied jeeps rattle on cobbles. Inside barracks, lists of suspects are being typed. This is the hinge where fugitives turn south and west, toward monasteries and ports, before the ink on surrender documents dries. The order that sets the night in motion was signed days earlier at Caserta, a localized surrender that binds Army Group C and the remnants of the Italian Social Republic. The effective hour arrives with a mix of relief and reckoning. 8th Army formations at the Adriatic and 5th Army units along the Po divide demobilization tasks, while Italian partisans and carabinieri move through streets where uniforms changed meaning overnight. Offices that managed fuel and ration cards now handle denunciations and lists of names. Curfew passes change hands at wooden counters under dim bulbs. You feel the weather shift, but the decisive currents are administrative. Who controls a gate? Who recognizes a face? Hunted men take their first decisions in minutes, not months. Some discard paybooks and collar tabs in canal water and present themselves as ordinary Wehrmacht in crowded cages set up near Parma and Verona, where identity checks rely on worn ledgers and overworked interpreters. Others walk south along rail lines and take seats on night trains past or toward Rome, where religious houses are known to keep guest rooms. They choose stone and silence, abbey walls, convent kitchens, parish attics. The smell is soup and incense. The sound is a bell and a latch. A guestbook entry that reads refugee from the north can cover a dozen pasts. Allied priorities are practical. Field security sections and the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps sweep known addresses, including former SD premises, and compile automatic arrest categories for SS, SD, and Gestapo personnel. Italian authorities, rebuilding under Allied Control Commission oversight, hold suspects where they can and forward dossiers to military legal sections. Trieste and the Isons, frontier add friction as Yugoslav and Allied lines meet. In that friction, men shift into Austria through the Brenner and into a different set of police jurisdictions. The balcony of Europe is full of watchers. The stairwells are crowded. Ports reopen as scars heal. In Liguria, Genoa and La Spezia clear wreckage and restart manifests. For now, ships carry demobilized soldiers, aid cargo, and officials. The clandestine traffic is footsteps, not hulls. Addresses of sympathetic rectories, courtyards where messengers pass folded certificates, rumors of Red Cross papers and visas that will not yet be issued, but are already imagined as exits. The routes do not exist as lines on any map this night. They are possibilities inside procedures that favor those who understand them. By midnight, the first lists are already moving. A name from an interrogation is typed twice, the carbon copy filed in a folder marked suspects. A description of a scar is added to a form. A birth date is underlined because two versions exist. These fragments will aggregate into registries, and later, into a central index that allies across zones will consult. For the men who slip into courtyards and cloisters, the new reality is clear. Survival depends on shrinking to a line of data that cannot be matched by any clerk with a stack of cards. A typed warrant slides across the desk of an Allied legal officer as CROWCASS, the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, expands in 1945-46. You hear the dry rasp of carbon paper as SS ranks, birth dates, and last known units are matched to photographs and aliases. The filing builds the pressure that drives men toward cloisters and false identities. The registry grows out of necessity. As liberated territories uncover massacre sites and concentration camps, Allied legal teams, drawn from British military government, the U.S. Judge Advocate General's Corps, and French staff courts, compile arrest priorities. Initially scattered across different field jurisdictions, These lists undergo centralization in July 1945 under SHAEF, then under Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, REAR, which establishes the core node in London. What results is a paper infrastructure designed not only for justice, but for coordination across fragmented military zones, American, British, French, Soviet, each governed by differing legal filters. The system is mechanical and personal. Names from testimonies, occupation files, or captured personnel cards are processed by clerks at typewriters with wooden drawers of carbon paper and erasers. One folder may contain 6 spellings of a surname, 3 date ranges, and a single photograph pulled from a Nazi personnel roster retrieved from SS headquarters in Berlin. The data is rarely complete. A scar noted on a doctor's intake form at Dachau becomes a key field. A death camp guard known only as Fritz with a limp becomes candidate number 11345 SS. A formal category of automatic arrest is established. Anyone identified as RSHA, Reich Security Main Office, Waffen-SS above the rank of Hauptscharführer, concentration camp personnel, Gestapo, or SD. CROWCASS functions on cards, cream-colored index slips sorted by country of origin, crime type, and urgency. Field security teams carry lists clipped to their dossiers. The first volume, published August 1945, contains 36,000 names and is distributed to Allied commands and legal branches. By 1947, it grows beyond 60,000. Each listing contains name, aliases, known ranks, pre- and post-war addresses, and a category code indicating genocide, reprisal killings, forced deportations, or abuse of prisoners. The unintended consequence of this system is velocity. Word of who is being hunted moves just as quickly through informal channels. In Germany, Austria, and Italy, names from these lists are whispered in barracks, printed in newspapers, and leaked in black market cafes where former combatants gather. Men who passed unnoticed now see former comrades detained and understand what a file in London can trigger in Genoa or Innsbruck. Each entry in CROWCASS crystallizes risk. Every matched detail pulls another man closer to a decision: hide, run, or disappear entirely. By late 1946, fugitives move with awareness of the registry. Clerics tapped to provide aid are sometimes shown copies of Allied lists, creating tension between humanitarian intent and legal obligation. In some parishes, a wrong name on a form means denial. In others, silence fills the gap. Every alias becomes a test. Can this name outrun the card index? Most cannot. The few that do rely not only on forged papers but on knowledge, which names are in the file, and which clerks are not yet holding them. You press a bell at a wooden gate, and the answering clack of a latch echoes under stone. In 1945-46, monasteries in South Tyrol and Rome take in refugees by the dozens, their guest books filling with names that will later be disputed or erased. The sanctuary impulse intersects with denazification, and hiding places acquire new functions. Across northern Italy and into Austria's borderlands, cloisters that once served monks and students now host displaced soldiers, widows of Italian fascists, and in some cases, men still carrying the ink of SS wrist tattoos. The buildings are suited to concealment: thick walls, few external windows, gardens surrounded by high masonry. Monastic routines obscure identities. Tenants pray under borrowed robes. Meals are silent. Clerical hosts, overwhelmed by the volume of post-war need, often do not question the origins of each arrival, especially when documents are missing or altered. Most orders follow a rule of hospitality. The past is not a required field on the intake form. In the Tyrolean town of Sturzing, Benedictine affiliates take in transient men listed simply as refugees or German ex-combatants. Guest logs, when preserved, are vague. Initials instead of full names, check-ins that skip birthdays or omit places of origin. Farther south, in the Friaul region, Capuchin monasteries near Udine receive similar waves, first soldiers, then civilians. Some claim to be fleeing Yugoslav reprisals in Trieste or Gorizia. Others arrive with letters from distant bishops, from relief coordinators in Rome, or from clergy who balance obligation with silence. In Rome, the pressure is more acute. Religious colleges and seminaries, particularly those attached to national groups, Croatian, German, Austrian, become nodal points. Some have been repurposed during the war for neutrality-linked functions and now transition again, hosting clerical students by day and transient guests by night. Church addresses become postal cover for fugitive networks. At some houses, incoming men kneel in chapel in the morning and walk out with travel directions in the evening. Not all hosts know who they are helping. A legitimate seminary guest may share quarters with a man who served at Sobibor or ran an interrogation block in Minsk. Allied officials monitor some of this quietly. Field security reports from 1946-47 include references to suspected Nazi safe houses linked to religious properties, but jurisdiction is limited. Vatican City is extraterritorial. Many monasteries are protected under local agreements or allied non-interference policies. Raids, when permitted, are rare and often fruitless. The guest has moved, the record is gone, or the name does not match allied lists. Only later, when trial testimonies surface or Red Cross documents are traced, do investigators realize that a well-swept monastery hallway once echoed with a step that should have been behind bars. In this setting, sanctuary is not always sanctuary in intent. Some clerics sympathize with former Axis causes, others act from religious charity. Officials tasked with extraditions later struggle to distinguish shelter offered in mercy from complicity masked in cassocks. The cloister designed for contemplation now serves too often as cover. It's not a conspiracy, it's a collision between desperate men trying to vanish and institutions committed to helping the vulnerable. In that collision, some of the 20th century's worst war criminals find moments of uninterrupted rest behind painted wooden gates. A heavy iron key turns in the gate at the Croatian College of San Girolamo in Rome. In 1945-47, the building's ledgers record traffic of Ustasha and other fugitives. Clerical networks overlap with political ties. From here, paths are traced to safe flats, parish offices, and eventually to a port. Located just off Piazza Navona, behind an unassuming facade, San Girolamo degli Illirici had served as a Croatian national church and clerical college since the late 16th century. After the collapse of the independent state of Croatia, NDH in 1945, the building becomes a hub. Its rector during this period, Monsignor Krunoslav Draganovic, is a former NDH official with political and clerical connections stretching from Zagreb to Rome and beyond. Within the cloistered interior, fugitives, some known war criminals, others political refugees, are received under the pretext of spiritual retreat or academic residence. The registry, where preserved, lists surnames followed by abbreviations. Rev. for Reverend, Mr. for Mr., and sometimes no title at all. According to post-war intelligence summaries and later witness statements, San Girolamo functions as more than a shelter. It becomes a logistical pivot. From this central point, visitors are referred to other religious houses, sympathetic parish clergy, or temporary residences under assumed names. The college's role is not simply to conceal, but to organize. Documents are prepared, forged baptismal certificates, statements of good conduct, letters recommending travel or stating lost nationality. Draganovic, whose own clerical status lends credibility, is known to accompany some individuals to consular appointments at nearby embassies or to offices of the International Committee of the Red Cross. His signature appears on forms later recovered in post-war immigration archives in South America. The Ustasha connection is not incidental. Many of the fugitives linked to San Girolamo are affiliated with the NDH regime, including former ministers, intelligence officers, and members of the fascist Ustasha militia, responsible for mass killings in Bosnia and Croatia. Their flight through Rome is both ideological and tactical. Yugoslavia, under Tito, demands repatriations, asserting their culpability in war crimes. Yet in Roman corridors, Cold War priorities begin to shadow legal ones. Anti-communist credentials, even among perpetrators, elicit sympathy in certain quarters, widening the cracks fugitives can slip through. Allied authorities are aware of San Girolamo's reputation. British and American military attachés in Rome report concerns to their offices, citing the location as a suspected Ratline interface. Yet protection of ecclesiastical property and lack of direct jurisdiction hinders intervention. Surveillance reports from 1946 list known associates entering and leaving the premises, but no arrests are made within its gates during this period. Vatican sovereignty, post-war instability, and divided priorities prevent direct confrontation. San Girolamo does not end the escape itself. It enables its next step. A man can enter with nothing but a name and leave with forged papers and a final destination. A convent near Bologna, a cottage near Trieste, a ship docked in Genoa. What makes the site exceptional is its precision. It is not a broad haven open to all. It is a waypoint for the select few with the right affiliations, the right names, and often the right crimes. The ledger has no commentary, just dates, rooms, initials. The history between the lines would only emerge one arrest, one manifest, one trial at a time. A stamp hits violet ink on the stationery of Santa Maria dell'Anima, the German national church in Rome. A Wahudal, a bishop with documented sympathy for certain former Nazis, writes endorsements that help secure identity papers or safe conduct. His letters do not end the hunt, they reroute it. Santa Maria dell'Anima stands just steps from Piazza Navona. Behind a Baroque facade, few modern passers-by would mark as significant. But during the fractious years of 1945 to 1948, the church's adjoining seminary, under Hudal's rectorship, becomes a channel for some of the most controversial refugee assistance in post-war Europe. Hudal, an Austrian by birth and a pre-war scholar of German theology, had been a prominent critic of modernism and communism. After the war, his opposition to Bolshevism appears, at times, as tacit approval of National Socialist fugitives, provided they aligned themselves with what he saw as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. His small office, furnished with dark wood and books wrapped in vellum, becomes a gateway for men who have discarded SS uniforms but not yet been found by Allied tribunals. The letters he writes are deceptively ordinary. Recommendations, confirmations of moral character, sometimes letters attesting to years of religious study or pious conduct. But placed alongside a baptismal certificate or shown to a visa officer, they become powerful credentials. Some are addressed to the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, which requires supporting documentation for travel documents for stateless persons. Others are used at South American consulates, notably Argentina and Paraguay, where ecclesiastical endorsements often carry weight. In case files examined decades later, Hudal's name appears on supporting documents for individuals including Franz Stangl, Commandant of Treblinka, and Gustav Wagner, deputy at Sobibor. Hudal does not go underground. He works from within a recognized institution on a known address. Allied authorities in Rome are aware of him. CIC, Counterintelligence Corps, reports from 1946 and 1947 identify him by name and note the frequency with which his endorsements appear alongside questionable applications. Yet no detention or interrogation follows. Church sovereignty and the lack of direct jurisdiction shield him, and his role stays largely unchallenged during the years when it matters most. Post-war interviews and later memoir fragments suggest that Hudal believed he was offering redemption, or at least a form of practical mercy. He maintained that many of the fugitives he assisted were soldiers or bureaucrats swept up in ideology or caught in systemic machinery. He denied knowingly helping war criminals, though documentary evidence and cross-referenced visa files contradict this claim. What Hudel provided was not simply protection, it was institutional decorum, layered over criminal flight. A man leaving a monastery with no status could depart Santa Maria dell'Anima with a stamped paper, a priest's blessing, and a narrative of legitimacy. The weight of Bishop Hudel's aid lies in what it allowed others to do. His letters, placed into the Red Cross bundle, formed the moral garnish that tipped an application into approval. His title, his ecclesiastical shield, made it harder for police or diplomatic officers to question the man in front of them. In the files of Argentina's Dirección General de Migraciones, Hudel's endorsements appear as footnotes to changed lives. War criminals granted entry, housed in boarding houses, and made employers of others. His stationery made their pasts harder to recover, and their futures easier to construct. Who signs the pass that lets a chaplain through this door? The Pontifical Commission for Assistance and Catholic relief bodies distribute food, clothes, and travel letters to thousands of displaced persons in 1944-47. Within that vast flow, some war criminals hide. Institutional policy, individual discretion, and post-war chaos produce a gray zone the hunters cannot easily penetrate. The Vatican's vast apparatus of relief work during and after World War II emerges from a genuine humanitarian need. By 1944, Rome itself is a city hosting tens of thousands of homeless civilians, repatriated forced laborers, prisoners of war, and political exiles. In response, Pope Pius XII formally expands the mandate of the Pontificia Commission di Assistenza, Pontifical Commission for Assistance, which works alongside Catholic charities, national aid societies, and international organizations to deliver daily support to those in need. From clerical rectories to suburban sacristies, aid stations are opened across Italy, especially in Rome, Trieste, and Genoa, distributing clothing, rations, medical vouchers, and referrals. Across the marble courtyards of curial offices and the back steps of church kitchens, hundreds of thousands of people receive help. This system, deliberately non-political in its official language, operates on trust. Identity is often confirmed by ecclesiastical testimonials, refugee declarations, or baptismal records. But within this sea of anonymity, a small number of former Nazi and fascist officials manage to blend in. Their success depends on scale, not conspiracy. None of the main agencies, in their public statements or internal directives, advocate sheltering war criminals. Yet in the fragmented paperwork piles and unstandardized vetting procedures of 1945-47, individual clerics can, and do, bend rules based on personal discretion or ideological sympathy. Some local clergy are approached directly by fugitives bearing references from other religious institutions, such as San Girolamo or Santa Maria dell'Anima. Others are unaware of the person's full history and sign off assuming they're assisting a political refugee or soldier fleeing Soviet occupation. Still others, particularly those in deep anti-communist circles, view former SS and Ustasha men as ideological allies. With neither a full access to allied lists like CROWCASS nor a centralized Vatican screening body, misjudgment or willful blindness becomes routine. Allied authorities watch this dynamic with growing concern. Reports from British and American intelligence teams note certain parishes and relief stations acting as repeat contact points for wanted men. Yet jurisdiction stops at the Vatican walls. Official diplomatic protests are filed. Private liaison appeals are made. But Rome's legal situation is unique. The Vatican is a sovereign entity. Most Catholic aid facilities in the city operate under church protection or extraterritorial privilege, making policing difficult without risking diplomatic scandal. The ambiguity is compounded by language. Relief letters issued by clergy often use spiritual or general humanitarian framing, phrases like "in need of protection" or "distressed pilgrim." For most recipients, displaced widows, destroyed families, these terms are literal and accurate. For a fugitive with a clean overcoat and a forged baptismal certificate, they are legal cover. What Allied hunters see as evasion, Vatican administrators insist is impartiality, assistance based on need, not ideology. Decades later, historians parsing Vatican archives and refugee records find no overarching directive to assist war criminals, but neither do they find strong procedural warnings or filters. The very ethic of discretion, intrinsic to church administration, becomes a liability when mixed with the impersonality of mass displacement. Who signed the pass? Sometimes it was a monsignor overloaded with forms. Sometimes a parish priest following conscience. Sometimes a moment where charity outpaced caution. In that silence the fugitives moved. A stamp hits purple ink. A gate opens and closes at the ICRC office in Geneva and in Italian cities by 1947-49. The International Committee of the Red Cross issues travel documents for stateless persons, recognized by many consulates. Screening is real but not foolproof. SS men exploit forged church certificates and assumed names to pass. In the power vacuum of post-war Europe, millions are displaced: former forced laborers, Holocaust survivors, political exiles, prisoners of war, and civilians from collapsed regimes. Statelessness becomes a widespread condition. Citizens of the now-defunct Third Reich, members of disbanded puppet states like the independent state of Croatia, and those declared ineligible for restitution under shifting national laws are left without legal identity. The International Committee of the Red Cross steps into this breach, offering basic travel and identification documents to people who can prove their origin, pre-war status, or compelling reasons for emigration. These Red Cross documents, sometimes called travel cards or ICRC identity certificates, are not passports in the classic sense, but they are accepted by consular authorities, especially those in South America eager to rebuild their labor forces through European immigration. Between 1947 and 1950, tens of thousands of people obtain ICRC papers. Offices in Rome, Milan, and Genoa process applicants from across Europe. Intended beneficiaries include legitimate refugees, those expelled by wartime upheaval, fleeing communist regimes, or returning from internment. But the documentation process hinges on supporting paperwork, baptism records, police letters, clerical recommendations, and personal attestations. In this space, forgery becomes functionally invisible. Former SS officers, Ustasha officials, and fascist collaborators exploit this weakness. They carry church-issued baptism certificates listing them as Anton Reiter or Helmut Gregor, backed by statements from parishes no longer standing, signed by priests relocated or deceased. A convincing alias, paired with a sober demeanor and a falsified place of birth, often a village destroyed by war, leaves screeners with little ground for denial. The ICRC, operating with severe post-war staffing constraints and relying on volunteer interviewers in many regions, screens applicants but lacks resources for deep vetting. Where local intelligence is limited and Allied wanted lists are inaccessible or incomplete, decisions are based on surface credibility. In theory, cooperation exists with Allied occupation authorities. In practice, data sharing is fragmented. Field personnel cannot consistently cross-reference facial features or military histories against CROWCASS or UNRRA registers. Forgeries pass not because the screeners were indifferent, but because the systems meant to detect fraud fell behind the realities on the ground. Consular offices in Genoa, Milan, and Naples accept these travel documents as primary identification when issuing visas to Argentina, Brazil, Syria, and other destinations. In the booking offices at Genoa's maritime terminals, Shipping manifests list names as they appear on ICRC documents. A man with such a paper becomes stateless yet admissible. His old identity buried. His new identity bureaucratically clean. Decades later, meticulous cross-referencing in immigration files and war crimes dossiers reveals that key figures, Joseph Mengele, Franz Stangl, Gustav Wagner, passed through these procedures undetected. Each received ICRC papers under aliases. Each received a visa through Catholic or secular channels, and each sailed within a system unable, or unprepared, to catch them. In retrospective statements, the Red Cross acknowledged that its humanitarian mandate had been misused. Yet at the time, it was a race between relief and deception, and some men always knew how to run one step faster than the paperwork chasing them. You fold a baptismal certificate that lists a village you have never seen. Parish seals, municipal forms, and passport photos become tools to launder identities. The handwriting matches because someone practices. Each forged line increases the cost of verification for overwhelmed authorities. In the first years after the war's end, identity is as much a currency as food or shelter. Official documents, certificates of baptism, birth records, school diplomas, are not merely bureaucratic. They are the only proof of who a person claims to be in a world where entire archives have burned or vanished. For fugitives from the SS, Gestapo, or fascist regimes, crafting a new life begins with crafting a believable past. And crafting that past requires paper. Post-war Italy, still crawling back to function under Allied military government AMG, becomes a hub for such transformations. Rome, Trieste, and Genoa see rapid black markets for documents, some forged outright, others issued under false pretenses in parishes and registries still too chaotic to vet every applicant. In one case documented years later, a forged birth record from South Tyrol is used to confirm a man's identity as a minor official from a bombed-out village, when in fact he had served as an officer at Sobibor. Clerks by necessity rely on supporting statements, certifications of good moral standing from priests, employment guarantees from charitable agencies. These build a profile for someone formally untraceable. The tools of this trade are deceptively simple: a functioning typewriter, a rubber stamp, ecclesiastical ink in violet or red, and access to blank registry forms. These often come from looted civil offices or from parishes unaware that they are aiding a fugitive. A practiced hand replicates church scribe lettering. The signature is learned and repeated. Within this shell, a new man is born. His papers match. His accent is close enough. His face does not yet appear on any posted list. The more complete the bundle, the baptism certificate, the citizen attestation, the Red Cross document, the harder it becomes for authorities to challenge. In Trieste, Allied officers note in early 1947 that forged papers coming from Catholic or local government channels often cannot be disputed immediately without triggering diplomatic complications or parish scandal. Inquiries would need to be routed through diocesan offices or municipal branches already overwhelmed by requests. Fugitives quickly learn the rhythm. Do not rush. Do not overreach. Present simple stories. Born in the East, family lost, working in labor service. Avoiding detection becomes a performance in restraint. If the paper trail is watertight, there is no need to run. The power lies in blending into the exhausted landscape. The forged documents are not counterfeit in appearance. They are official in every detail, authenticated by someone somewhere, who either didn't ask questions or chose not to. By the time a shipping agent at Genoa or a visa officer in Milan reads the documents, the identity has already hardened. A real photograph and a plausible lie edged in notary ink will carry a former war criminal across the ocean and into the next decade. Erasing the past is not the work of fire. It's the work of stamps, folds, and names pressed in careful lines across forms no one has time to verify. You feel tar and salt under your shoes on a creaking gangway at Molo Vecchio. Genoa's shipping registers in 1947-51 show repeated sailings to Buenos Aires and Montevideo. Among refugees are men with Red Cross documents and new names. The harbor's cranes lift cargo, and with it, the weight of departure. Genoa after the war is a city of movement, damaged and unfinished, yet functional enough to serve as Italy's most critical passenger port between 1947 and 1951. Reconstruction efforts clear debris from wartime air raids and fires. Near the port's eastern quays, warehouses are patched and cranes restored. Shipping agents take up offices near Via Gramsci and Piazza Caricamento. People's names move across manifests just as goods do, on ledgers, invoices, and port clearances. Each berth becomes a threshold between refuge and impunity, opportunity and escape. Among the outward-bound travelers are Polish survivors, Estonian exiles, and Austrian peasants seeking a new beginning. But embedded among this human tide are fugitives, former members of the Waffen-SS, Gestapo officials, Ustasha ministers, each carrying carefully assembled documentation. Their travel documents typically include a Red Cross identity card, a letter of introduction from a parish or relief group, a second-class or steerage ticket purchased with funds often transferred from abroad. The ships they board, Italian vessels like the SS Corrientes, SS Giovanna C., or chartered freighters flying Panamanian flags, are not clandestine. They are regular, scheduled departures, published in maritime almanacs and reported in shipping journals. The port authorities follow procedure. Passport control officers attached to Italian maritime police stamp departures, but rarely deny exit to those with valid documents, especially if those papers carry ecclesiastical endorsements or Red Cross authentication. The IRO, International Refugee Organization, reviews some applications but not all. Consular inspections for Brazil, Argentina, or Paraguay are narrow in scope, focused on physical health, available sponsorship, and whether the passenger might be a public charge. Political histories are addressed only when flagged directly. At Molo Vecchio and Ponte Cerrito, priests and local fixers known to some of the fugitives operate quietly. They escort nervous travelers, sometimes still in clerical garb, who murmur a different name at each checkpoint. Whispers move back from the crew, instructions on whom not to question, which papers to simply accept and file. Once aboard, the fugitive becomes a passenger, indistinct among dock workers, nuns, war widows, and hopeful immigrants headed for the Argentine pampas or Brazilian interior. The smell of diesel and fish fades as the harbor recedes. For many, Genoa is the final moment of fear. After this dock, only water lays between them and a new legal identity. The gangway thuds up, the manifest closes, and 5 days later, a gray speck on a manifest line down in the ship's purser ledger becomes another man on a street in Buenos Aires, alive, resettled, and gone. A consular grill slides open in Genoa as a blue visa stamp dries on a page. Argentine immigration policy under Juan Perón admits large numbers of Europeans in the late 1940s, and some officials ease the way for known fascists and SS men. With a visa and a travel document, a cabin far below decks becomes the last European room. From 1946 to 1952, Argentina absorbs more than 250,000 European immigrants. Many are displaced persons and wartime refugees, but buried in passenger manifests are wanted men traveling under new names and misleading identities. In the shadow of Argentina's post-war policies lies a pragmatic and sometimes ideological posture, strengthening the national labor force, importing skilled tradesmen, and positioning Argentina as a leader of the Latin world all drive the state's open-door policy, particularly during Perón's first presidency, 1946-1955. But beyond these objectives, internal government circles, particularly within the Immigration Bureau and Foreign Ministry, deepen access routes for fugitive fascist officials, some with direct links to the Third Reich. This facilitation is partly bureaucratic, partly covert. Within the consulate in Genoa, Argentine officials review applications supported by ICRC travel documents, baptismal certificates, and affidavits from sponsors already in Argentina. These sponsors often consist of sympathetic émigré groups, lobbying networks, or in select cases, former Axis collaborators who had arrived earlier. Post-war Catholic relief agencies headquartered in Rome or working within Genoa provide letters of moral support or declarations of non-criminal background. A fugitive with the right paperwork and no glaring inconsistencies can receive a visa within days. Verification functions nebulously. Argentine diplomatic staff lack access to Allied war crimes registries, and know your customer vetting in South America at this time is minimal. Some officials knowingly issue visas to men linked with the SS or Ustasha under the justification of anti-communist credentials. Others take bribes in cash or valuables. Testimonies later gathered by Argentine human rights groups point to informal agreements between local shipping agents and immigration officials to expedite departures for trusted intermediaries, mostly through Genoa, Naples, and occasionally Marseille. The visa itself, a rectangular print in Spanish with blue ink, issuing authority and entry window, is accepted by port officials as final clearance. With this stamp fixed beside a Red Cross travel card, the bearer becomes legally admissible. Ship crews view stamped passengers as processed. The identity may be false, but the paperwork is real. For the fugitive, this is often the final link in a chain of cover stories. Once stamped, the name and nationality exist in consular logs, though inconsistently matched with later national archives. The man steps aboard not as the officer of a death camp or a militia commander, but as an agricultural worker named Ricardo, a skilled welder called Altman, or an orphaned refugee from a non-existent village in Burgenland. The Argentine visa seals more than travel. It closes the institutional memory of war crimes, at least for now. Behind the consular grill, the stamp dries in silence, and 2 weeks later, an ocean away, a customs officer glances at it once, then waves the passenger along into the sunlight of Buenos Aires. You hand over a Red Cross document dated 1949 and an Argentine visa. The manifest records the name Helmut Gregor. Mengele, wanted for selections at Auschwitz, departs Genoa in 1949 and arrives in Buenos Aires weeks later. The alias will hold for years because the paperwork holds. Joseph Mengele's escape from Europe is not dramatic. It is procedural. After serving as SS Hauptsturmführer and performing selections at Auschwitz-Birkenau, Mengele disappears into the anonymity of post-war Bavaria. He initially hides near Günzburg, shielded by family and Nazi sympathizers. Arrested briefly in 1945, under his real name, but not identified as the infamous camp physician, Mengele avoids immediate prosecution due to gaps in Allied intelligence and incomplete registries in the war's chaotic aftermath. Once released, he returns underground and begins the layered process of transforming himself from a hunted man into a name with a visa. By the late 1940s, Mengele becomes part of a broader flow of fugitives guided through southern Germany into Austria and Italy. He adopts the alias Helmut Gregor, reportedly the name of a dead German soldier, and moves through a series of stops, likely monasteries, private homes, and Catholic-run boarding houses. Documentation from various investigations confirms that Mengele received assistance from networks sympathetic to former Nazis or indifferent to political scrutiny, networks that extended into clerical circles and local administrative offices. In Genoa, under the Helmut Gregor alias, Mengele secures a travel document from the International Committee of the Red Cross in August 1949. To obtain this, he submits a church-issued baptism certificate and affidavit of support, routine materials, but not thoroughly verified. The Red Cross, overwhelmed by volume and constrained by post-war resource limits, does not detect the false identity. With the ICRC document in hand, Mengel applies for and receives an Argentine entry visa. Argentine consular staff in Genoa approve the application as part of broader immigration policies favoring European settlers and professionals. Whether the officials processing his case consciously recognize or ignore his past remains unclear, but no evidence suggests they had access to Allied war crimes lists by name. He boards the steamship North King, departing Genoa in late July 1949. Passenger manifests in the Argentine National Archives list a man named Helmut Greger, born in 1911, of German origin. He disembarks in Buenos Aires in early August. No arrest, no interrogation, no resistance. Legally, he exists, on paper, confirmed by stamps, ship logs, and visa registers. The boat docks. Another man walks ashore. In Argentina, Mengel resumes life with minimal concealment. He applies for residency, eventually receiving legal status. From 1950 onward, he lives in the open, in boarding houses, later in rural provinces, working in agricultural or pharmaceutical roles. The alias holds because the structure holds. There is no match between Red Cross records and war crimes registries, no shared data between consular offices and international tribunals. Orders for his arrest exist in Europe, but they do not cross the Atlantic. Mengel's case reveals how plausibility, not secrecy, protects fugitives. With a believable alias, verified by real documents, even the most notorious war criminals can slip into legality. No forged passport is needed when the real stamps come from real institutions. The ship sails. The papers match. For a decade, nothing interrupts the life built on the name Helmut Greger. A grainy passport photo sits under a paper clip. The name typed below reads Ricardo Clement. In 1950, Eichmann secures an ICRC travel document in Italy and an Argentine visa, then sails from Genoa to Buenos Aires. The exact ship name appears variably in sources, but the route is documented. The trail left behind is thin by design, a card index and a disembarkation log. Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Nazi regime's deportation system and one of the principal facilitators of the Holocaust, evaded justice not through hiding in caves or forests, but by exploiting the post-war bureaucracy. After the collapse of Nazi Germany, he disappears into the debris of the Third Reich. Initially detained under a false name in an American-run internment camp in northern Germany, Eichmann escapes before his true identity is processed. He finds refuge in Lower Saxony, then moves further south using aliases and false documentation provided by former SS contacts and sympathetic networks. By 1950, with war crimes trials concluding and the urgency of Allied investigations fading, the systems of fugitives grow in confidence. Eichmann follows an already traveled route through Austria and into Italy, passing via Bolzano and into South Tyrol. Testimonies and intelligence files from later decades indicate that he likely received shelter in Franciscan monasteries along the way, part of the same loose network that helped smuggle out other high-ranking figures. He eventually arrives in Genoa, still operating as a principal exit port for immigrants to Latin America. In Italy, under the name Ricardo Clement, Eichmann applies for identity certificates from the International Committee of the Red Cross as a stateless person. He submits supporting documentation, a fabricated personal history, a baptismal certificate sourced from a cooperating parish, and a signed affidavit of support from an Argentine contact, likely arranged through intermediaries within the expatriate German community. The ICRC issues the travel document. An Argentine visa follows, granted at the Genovese consulate under relaxed immigration policies favorable to European migrants. The ship he boards, variously named in sources as the Giovanna C., North King, or San Marco, departs Genoa in mid-1950. Argentine port entry records show Ricardo Clement disembarking in Buenos Aires weeks later, unremarked, undocumented by authorities as anything other than a German worker. With the papers in order, no further scrutiny is applied. Eichmann settles in a suburb north of the city, working for Mercedes-Benz under his alias. He lives modestly, invisible in a country already hosting dozens of lesser-known fugitives. No attempt is made to reclaim his name. The false identity, protected by real documents, is stronger than denial. In Argentina's laissez-faire immigration climate, falsehood becomes stability. For the next 10 years, Eichmann is buried not in jungle or disguise, but in paperwork. Quiet, routine, precise. A man enforced mass deportation by trains in Europe. Now, he rides the linea mitre to work 5 days a week. The index card under the paperclip remains in an archive in Geneva. The disembarkation log sits in the Argentine National Archive. Between them, a man disappears, not by vanishing, but by becoming someone who never existed in the first place. A sealed envelope rides in a CIC safe. Inside, an assets file mentions skills and liabilities. The U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps employs Barbie after 1945 and later facilitates his 1951 departure via Genoa to South America under the name Klaus Altmann. War crimes warrants collide with early Cold War priorities. Klaus Barbie was no ordinary fugitive. Known as the Butcher of Lyon for his role as Gestapo head in the French city, Barbie oversaw torture, deportations, and executions during his tenure in occupied France. Convicted in absentia by French courts for multiple war crimes, he nevertheless escaped post-war justice for over 3 decades. Unlike men who relied solely on forged papers and sympathetic clergy, Barbie benefited from the shield of American intelligence. For a time, his past served as a credential rather than a liability. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Barbie was detained by U.S. forces in the American zone of Germany, but was quickly identified as a potential asset. The Counterintelligence Corps, SIC, responsible for detecting Soviet infiltration, saw value in Barbie's knowledge of communist tactics, intelligence processes, and underground networks. Though Allied war crimes authorities had listed him as wanted, internal CIC memos, now declassified, show handlers assessing operational benefit against public optics. He was recruited, paid, and protected. Throughout the late 1940s, Barbie remained in Germany under CIC supervision, working against Soviet-aligned groups. But the growing French pressure for extradition, especially as details of his wartime actions became public within occupied Europe, made his continued presence politically untenable. The solution: extraction. The CIC, with the help of Vatican-linked escape networks and intermediaries in Rome, arranged Barbie's departure in early 1951. Under the alias Klaus Altmann, he received a Red Cross travel document claiming him to be a stateless technician. The falsified name and personal history were backed by affidavits stating longer residence abroad, economic hardship, and political persecution, classic markers in post-war immigration vetting. Barbie boarded a ship in Genoa in March 1951. The passenger manifest lists Altmann Klaus, German, born 1919, technician by trade. Upon arrival in Argentina, he later crossed into Bolivia, where he lived openly for decades as a German expatriate businessman. He went on to advise the Bolivian military regime on interrogation techniques and internal security, ironically applying skills once honed under the Reich. His case demonstrates the intersection of geopolitics and impunity. For Barbie, unlike Eichmann or Mengele, the route to South America was not built on deception alone. It was sanctioned, arranged, and covered by Western officials. For war crimes investigators, it was a betrayal coded in acronyms, not in forged ink. CIC, AMCIT, ARC. In the chessboard of the Cold War, a man responsible for hundreds of murders became a knight quietly moved off the board before the trial could begin. You cross platforms at Rome Termini with a letter of introduction in your coat. Stengel, former commandant of Sobibor and Treblinka, moves via Rome to Syria in 1948 on Red Cross papers, then to Brazil in 1951. The network relies on church addresses and shipping agents. Years later, a routine verification will unspool the thread that leads to his arrest. Franz Stengel's name appears in the core records of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi extermination campaign that claimed over 1.5 million lives in Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec between 1942 and 1943. As camp commandant at both Sobibor and later Treblinka, Stengel held operational responsibility for mass killings. Arrested by U.S. forces in Austria at the end of the war, he was initially handed over to the Austrian authorities and detained in Linz. But in 1947, with war crimes trials delayed and jails overburdened, Stengel escaped custody, disguised as a civilian and with help from associates linked to underground networks of former SS and police officials. From Austria, Stengel enters Italy through the Brenner Pass, moving south using forged papers issued through clerical channels. Testimony gathered decades later outlines how he arrived in Rome using a pseudonym, likely among the stream of German-speaking displaced persons, passing themselves off as refugees from the East. He finds lodging through church-linked hostels and receives assistance through contacts within the Austrian Catholic community. At least one intermediary is believed to be associated with the Croatian College of San Girolamo or affiliated national churches. These contact points lead him toward the logistical pieces needed for departure: an identity, a travel document, and a port. Red Cross documentation registers Stengel under the alias Franz Suchomel, a fabricated identity supported by a baptism certificate and notarized affidavits. He applies for resettlement outside Europe and receives approval for Syria, a destination known for taking a small but regular stream of German immigrants by 1948. The ship departs Genoa later that year. In Damascus, Stengel finds temporary factory work with support from expatriate communities. His time there is quiet but short-lived. Concerns over stability and opportunity prompt a second move. In 1951, Stengel enters Brazil under the name Franz Suchomel, later reverting to his real surname once local legal status is obtained. For over a decade, he works at a Volkswagen plant outside Sao Paulo, unrecognized and untouched. But in 1967, during a verification operation stemming from Simon Wiesenthal's research and West German judicial inquiries, Austrian records flag his original file. Cross-referencing with immigration data in Sao Paulo and Cairo, using name variants and aliases, triggers a renewed investigation. He is arrested in 1967 and extradited the following year. His capture becomes a landmark in post-war justice, not simply due to his crimes, but because his trace had been so thoroughly hidden under what appeared to be legitimate international paperwork. The route that began with folded letters in a railway coat pocket had survived for 2 decades, until a name, once erased, re-emerged in one too many files. A paperback with a bold acronym sits on a kiosk. In an archive, a ledger shows scattered cells. Historians find multiple overlapping escape networks rather than one monolithic Odessa. Clerical nodes, XSS comradeships, and smugglers fill the map. The myth simplifies. The paperwork complicates. The acronym Odessa, short for Organisation der ehemaligen SS-Angehörigen, organization of former SS members, entered public consciousness in the post-war decades largely through popular accounts and novels. Most notably, Frederick Forsyth's The Odessa File gave the impression of a vast, hierarchical Nazi underground ensuring the escape and survival of war criminals across the globe. But historians with access to archives in Germany, Italy, Argentina, and the Vatican find no evidence of a single master plan or command structure coordinating such efforts. The reality, as documented through immigration records, ICRC files, captured intelligence reports, and ecclesiastical correspondence, reveals fragmented constellations, overlapping, often improvised, networks facilitated by separate groups with limited coordination and a narrow focus on immediate logistical needs. What surfaces instead are clusters of aid. In Rome and Genoa, church-affiliated escape routes center around national institutions, Croatian, Austrian, German, where individual clergy, often deeply anti-communist, assist fugitives for reasons ranging from ideology to mistaken charity. In Bavaria and South Tyrol, local support comes from well-organized Wehrmacht veteran associations, Kameradschaftsverband, that provide false documents and shelter. In Vienna, Salzburg, Linz, and Milan, black market smugglers, sometimes former soldiers themselves, move people along the same corridors used for cigarettes or arms. The name Die Spin, the spider, is attached by post-war intelligence to remnants of Otto Skorzeny's network, active in providing escape lines and possibly financing some routes in Spain and South America. But these two lack central coordination. At most, they offer a loose ideological umbrella for XSS personnel and National Socialists aiding one another. Files captured by Western intelligence during the early 1950s suggest some communication between cells, code names, pseudonymous correspondence, but no centralized command. The convergence occurs not in doctrine but in destination. Multiple actors, from church staff to shipping agents to intelligence contacts, converge on ports like Genoa and Trieste, certified documents in hand, layered with real stamps and false lives. What makes the escape possible is not strategic planning, but a fractured Europe where records don't talk to each other. The term Odessa survives more as shorthand for a system of absences, absent cross-checking, absent prosecutions, absent political will. In short, the logistics were real, the acronym was the fiction. The truth was messier, quieter, and written in the margins of customs forms, guest books, and baptism certificates, never in a master ledger stamped Odessa, but in thousands of small decisions, errors, and aids inked in violet and never recalled. You ride in the escort truck past a modest house on Garibaldi Street, Buenos Aires, in May 1960. Coordinated tips, West German prosecutors and Israeli operatives converge on Eichmann 15 years after the war. The capture is clean, the documentation precise. Ratlines built delay, not immunity. By the end of the 1950s, the landscape has shifted. The chaos of post-war migration is gone, and the scattered files of the initial Allied war crimes program are being consolidated by new institutions. West German prosecutors at the Zentralstelle in Ludwigsburg, civilian investigators like Simon Wiesenthal in Vienna, and the Israeli government's intelligence agency Mossad. All three operate in separate lanes, but they share a common conviction that the fugitives of the Nazi killing machine are alive, aging, and still traceable. Eichmann had disappeared in 1945, passed through Austria and Italy with Red Cross papers, and arrived in Argentina under the alias Ricardo Clement, as documented in earlier case files. For years, Clement lived quietly, working at a Mercedes-Benz plant in General San Martin, near Buenos Aires. He was no longer hiding in the jungle. He was attending family dinners and walking to work. Survivors and Jewish communities in Argentina suspected his presence, but hard evidence proved elusive. Then came a breakthrough in 1957. A tip passed from Lothar Hermann, a German Jewish immigrant, to prosecutor Fritz Bauer in West Germany, and eventually to Israeli operatives. From that point, the methods of the hunters evolve. Surveillance is quiet but methodical. Photographs confirm the match. Flight manifests are checked against past Red Cross files held in secret archives. Mossad, operating without a formal presence in Argentina, prepares a covert extraction plan. On 11 May 1960, Eichmann is seized less than 100 meters from his home. The operation is conducted with discipline and without violence. He is held in a safe house until he can be flown out on an El Al aircraft, disguised as a crew member too ill to walk. The Eichmann capture marks a turning point in the memory and prosecution of Holocaust crimes. His trial in Jerusalem is the first to center not just on camp commandants, but on the architecture of genocide, planning, trains, signatures, and policy. The Ratlines that once protected Eichmann did not collapse, they were simply outpaced. The passage of time had not dulled the paper trail, it had merely tested the diligence of those willing to follow it. And now, finally, the documentation caught up with the man. A handheld camera whirs outside a delicatessen in Bariloche in 1994. Priebke, wanted for the Ardeatine Caves massacre in Rome, is identified on tape. Local familiarity yields to extradition papers. The comfortable alias collapses in the frame rate of modern television. For nearly 5 decades, Erich Priebke lived in plain sight. After the war, he had followed the same route as many of his fellow fugitives. Escape from internment in Germany, movement south to Italy, acquisition of Red Cross identity papers, and eventual emigration to Argentina. The documentation he presented, issued in Genoa in 1948 under his real name, granted him legal status. Argentina under Juan Perón welcomed thousands of European immigrants, and Priebke, portraying himself as a refugee, settled in the lakeside town of San Carlos de Bariloche. There, amid Swiss-style chalets and quiet streets, he built a life. Teaching German at a local school and running a delicatessen, he mingled with locals, many of whom knew of his wartime past, some even approved of it. Official requests for his extradition existed but languished without pressure or political will. In the pre-digital era, a forged identity was not always necessary. A change of address and a continent's distance could suffice. That changed with a camera. In 1994, an American television journalist, Sam Donaldson of ABC News, traveled to Bariloche with a hidden video crew, having received credible tips that Priebke was still alive and living under his real name. Outside a storefront, Donaldson approached him, with cameras rolling, and asked directly about his role in the 1944 massacre at the Ardeatine Caves in Rome, executed as a reprisal ordered by the German occupation forces for a partisan bombing. Priebke did not hide or flee. He responded candidly, acknowledging his participation and justifying his actions as military duty. The footage was broadcast globally, and in Italy, outrage followed. Within days, new extradition requests were filed. The Argentine judiciary, after years of stalling such cases, finally acted. Priebke, who had never expected his small town to become ground zero for international justice, was arrested and held pending removal. Legal obstacles arose, but pressure from both international observers and Argentina's domestic human rights groups accelerated the process. In 1996, Priebke was extradited to Italy and faced charges in a military court. The camera had done what decades of paper trails and diplomatic cables could not. It collapsed the distance between the post-war world and the crimes that shaped it. Visibility became accountability. A typed extradition request returns with a red stamp. Denied. Walter Roth lives in Chile until 1984. Gustav Wagner remains in Brazil despite requests. National courts weigh treaties, evidence, and politics. A hunt can find a face yet still fail to move it. By the 1970s and 1980s, the investigators, journalists, government prosecutors, survivors, and teams like those led by Simon Wiesenthal had begun assembling complete files. Aliases, addresses, arrival dates, and source testimonies tracing the post-war trail of Nazi fugitives across South America. But knowing where someone is does not mean they will be returned. Extradition becomes the next barrier, often legal, often bureaucratic, always political. Walter Roth, an SS Standartenführer, deployed during the war to develop and supervise the use of mobile gas vans, fled Europe in 1949. His route closely mirrors those used by others. A stop in Rome, a Red Cross travel document under a new name, then a ship to South America. He enters Chile under the name José Bartel and eventually reclaims his real identity once naturalized. While in Chile, he becomes a consultant to Augusto Pinochet's secret police during the 1970s. West Germany submits formal extradition requests in 1963 and again in 1972, but Chilean courts refuse. The justifications include statutes of limitations, lack of dual criminality, and public order concerns. Rolf dies in Santiago in 1984, never having stood trial. Gustav Wagner, deputy commandant at Sobibor extermination camp, hides in Brazil under the name Gunter Mendel until he is discovered in 1978. Brazilian police arrest him after German, Austrian, and Israeli agencies provide corroborated intel. But Brazil's Supreme Court denies extradition in 1979, citing procedural limitations in its bilateral treaties and assurances of due process. Wagner himself publicly claims responsibility for his conduct, but expresses no remorse. Shortly after his legal victory, he is found dead in his home, officially ruled a suicide. Some historians have questioned the circumstances, but no further legal action follows. The cases of Rolf and Wagner represent the limits of post-war accountability. Paperwork structured their departure, but also hardened their security. Extradition treaties often required tight definitions. Named crimes had to match both legal systems, evidence had to originate from state-recognized investigations, and a suspect had to be a citizen of the requesting state. These requirements were often impossible to meet decades after the fact. In these instances, justice knew where the front door was. It just never opened. An archivist unties cotton string on a gray box. The air smells of old glue. The ICRC revisits its post-war document policies. Church archives and testimonies clarify how individual clerics, not monolithic institutions, aided escapes. Agencies publish partial files. Ambiguities recede where documentary edges align. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating into the early 2000s, governments, religious institutions, and humanitarian organizations began to confront their roles, direct and indirect, in the escape of Nazi war criminals. The reckoning is slow, often partial, but inch by inch, the silence around the Ratlines is pressed into record, catalog number, and declassified memo. The boxes unpacked in Geneva, Vienna, Rome, Berlin, and Buenos Aires begin to draw clear lines between myth and mechanism. The International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, under growing scholarly and public pressure, opened sections of its wartime and post-war archives starting in 1990. In 1996, the ICRC publicly acknowledged that its travel documents, issued to stateless persons and refugees between 1945 and 1951, had been exploited by known war criminals. While the organization emphasized that its mandate focused on humanitarian need under international law, it admitted that screening mechanisms had been insufficient and that files had been granted without sufficient verification. Investigators were able to confirm that Red Cross-issued documents under assumed identities had been used by Joseph Mengele, Adolf Eichmann, Franz Stangl, and others. Meanwhile, the Vatican's own archival process advances cautiously. For decades, officials emphasized that there was no coordinated Vatican initiative to protect Nazis, and that any such aid came from individual clergy acting on personal conviction or respondent compassion. However, when limited access was granted to documents from the Pontificia Commission di Assistenza and relevant church offices, researchers located evidence of letters, endorsements, and logistical connections, particularly involving figures like Bishop Owa Hudel and Monsignor Kronislav Draganovic. These clerics, it became clearer, were known to the Vatican, but their involvement in Ratlines was neither centrally authorized nor formally condemned. In Germany, files from the Bundesarchiv reveal the minute detail West German intelligence held on fugitives abroad, many of whom were quietly monitored but not pursued. In the United States, the 1998 Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act led to the declassification of CIA and CIC documents, exposing cases where Cold War utility had overridden moral responsibility. Pattern by pattern, institution by institution, the fragments arranged themselves, not into a conspiracy but into something colder: systemic neglect, bureaucratic isolation, and moral compartmentalization. The paper trail was always there. Only now are its edges being read aloud. You open a museum drawer lined with card indexes, aliases, visas, ship names. The Ratlines shaped how states built post-war justice units, from the U.S. OSI to German Zentralstelle. They reshaped Interpol's posture toward war crime fugitives. The roots are closed, but the paperwork remains, teaching investigators what to look for next time. In the decades following the initial wave of escapes through the Ratlines, the legacy of these covert roots left deep institutional and legal footprints. By the 1970s, justice no longer depended solely on finding a man hiding in a village. Justice depended on archives, cross-border intelligence, and the ability to parse a decades-old visa application for signs of fraud. From the United States to Germany, Argentina to Israel, states began to adapt their policies and structures to follow men who had already vanished from public view. In the United States, the formation of the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, in 1979 marked a shift in how Nazi war criminals were pursued, not as political targets, but as immigration fraud cases. The OSI, working with INS and FBI files, traced naturalization paperwork and matched it against newly available archives of camp rosters and Einsatzgruppen reports. The unit's foundational assumption was simple: those who had disappeared once could be found again in the paper trail. And they were. In Germany, the Zentralstelle der Landesjustizverwaltungen, headquartered in Ludwigsburg, became a central node for compiling and reviewing archived evidence tied to Nazi crimes. Formally established in 1958, it digitized and cross-indexed testimonies, unit lists, and trial records, often relying on input from international partners. Eichmann's capture, Stengel's extradition, and even delayed cases like those of John Demjanjuk in the 2000s did not resolve the story of the Ratlines. They prolonged it. Each case showed how delay, aliases, and state-level reluctance extended the reach of impunity. Interpol, once reluctant to handle war crimes, faced criticism for its early failure to cooperate with extradition requests and its narrow interpretation of political offenses. By the 1980s, renewed legal frameworks pushed the organization toward greater cooperation with national prosecutorial units, especially as Cold War demands gradually receded. In public memory, the Ratlines now live in dual form: a cautionary tale of evasion and a catalyst for institutional reform. Museums, from the Documentation Center in Munich to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, now hold not just testimonies from survivors, but the freighted artifacts of the escape: falsified Red Cross letters, ship manifests from Genoa, and visas with aliases written in neat type. The fugitives of the 1940s forced the 20th century to build an entirely new architecture of justice, not just for what had been done, but for those who vanished in its aftermath.